are in listen-only mode.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to this webinar on integrating e-mobility into the electrical grid. I'm Melina Diamantopoulou, Head of Production and Climate Action. Thank you very much for joining us, and it's a pleasure to welcome so many listeners to this webinar. We have received over 600,000 registrations, and a testament to the excellent speakers we have participating and sharing their thoughts and experiences in this important topic. Please be aware that this session will be recorded and a link will be emailed to you shortly after the webinar is complete, so you will be able to listen to it again and share it with your peers. Just to let you know about climate action, for the last 10 years, we have worked in a unique partnership with the United Nations Environment to develop their official publication and events with the aim to establish partnerships between the public and private sector to accelerate international sustainable development and advance the green economy. Today's webinar takes place ahead of the 8th Sustainable Innovation Forum, the largest business-focused event held alongside the annual Conference of Parties this year in Bonn, Germany, the home of the UNFCCC. The Sustainable Innovation Forum brings together more than 600 carefully handpicked delegates, including ministers of energy and climate change, blue-chip CEOs, mayors, responsible investors, development banks, green entrepreneurs, and media for 2 packed days of capacity building, networking, collaboration, and deal-making that will galvanize and fast-track the green economy. For more information on the forum, the speakers, and anything else, please visit the website at www.cop-23.com. Which brings me to today's webinar on integrating e-mobility into the electrical grid. E-mobility is a more than an established crucial solution to cope with the mobility sector challenges arising from climate change, global warming, and the need for decarbonisation. There is a considerable increase of electric and hybrid cars in the portfolio of automotive producers, while regulators demand and support the expansion of e-mobility through regulatory frameworks and incentive schemes. Through this webinar, and the webinar will illustrate this role of e-mobility from the different viewpoints of the automotive industry, energy providers, and key stakeholders in this energy policy debate. I feel extremely privileged to welcome 3 excellent speakers to address this topic, and I would like to welcome Dr. Thomas Becker, Vice President of Government Affairs for BMW Group, Christian Hochfeld, Managing Director of Agora, and Dean Taylor, Principal Advisor for the Southern California Edison. Please don't forget to send your questions via Twitter or the GoToWebinar question option on the software you have on the right-hand side of your screens. Each speaker will take a few minutes to present their views, following which we will take questions from our listeners. You can submit your questions via Twitter, as I've already said, and we will try to get through as many as relevant questions possible through the hour time frame. And with that, I shall hand over to our first speaker, Dr. Thomas Becker, Vice President of the Governmental and External Affairs at the BMW Group in Munich. In his position, he supervises the worldwide representation of BMW Group's political interests. He oversees the company's approach to integrate political topics into the product and business communication of the group, as well as steers the sustainability communication. Thomas, can you hear us?
Yeah, thank you so much for that invitation and for the opportunity to share some current developments that we see and that we are part of on advancing electric mobility. So if we move to the next slide.
Yep, you should have access to the slide, but I can do that.
Yep, here it is. No, now it's worked. So all the industry is speaking at the moment about this acronym ACES. Some spell it differently, call it CASE or whatever. But in any case, it's what currently changes our industry more than all the developments we have been seeing in the last 100 years of its history. The first is the electrification, the E of ACES, which mainly driven by California, but also being the big issue in China and in many of the European markets, is the predominant topic on the drivetrain side. But on the other side, what we see is the modification of its usage mode, meaning shared vehicles. And BMW with our Drive Now arm is a strong player and also seeking to utilize this option for our business. But the other big thing is connectivity and automation, meaning vehicles which are not managed anymore by its driver alone and in isolation from one another, but which are connected not only with other cars, but with the entire infrastructure around them. And in the future are also driven in an automated mode, meaning autonomous being a synonym for that. So what I will elaborate on in a moment is about the connection between the C and the E, the benefits that we see of more connectivity for optimizing the usage of electric vehicles. So moving to the next slide. This is what we have been seeing as BMW's development in terms of EV sales since November 1913, when we launched our first fully electric vehicle, the BMW i3. And as you can see, we have been growing considerably until August this year with the i3 itself, but increasingly also with an increasingly broad portfolio of plug-in hybrid vehicles, which in the meantime cover all the segments that we are active in, from compact vehicles like the 2 Series ranging to the 7 Series sedan and also to the X5. We will hit around 100,000 electrified vehicles sold this year. And to illustrate the market situation we are in at the moment, this is what we see on the next chart. BMW at the moment is the leader in Europe for vehicles which can be charged on the grid and drive electrically. So very clearly, when we talk about electric driving, we mean pure battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids. And although some indications of our friends from the industry are lost, at least the information made it into that format that BMW at the moment in Europe is in a leading position. On the other hand, we hugely depend on local framework conditions. This chart shows how big the share of electric vehicles is in the different European markets. And as you can see, the differences are enormous. 2/3 of the BMWs sold in Norway are electric in the meantime, but only a little bit above 3% of the BMWs sold in Germany. We have strong markets like Belgium and Sweden, who are relatively small. So there is no such thing at the moment as a unified European market. We are confronted with a situation where very local framework conditions, even looking at the city level, define the market for our products. And as an illustration of that, just look at the next chart, which shows the density of charging infrastructure just in a comparison between Germany and the Netherlands. So BMW is operating, and here I'm touching already on connectivity, what is called Charge Now, which is a mechanism whereby you can use electricity by different providers with one billing system and one user identification card. And if you look at the charging points which are integrated in that system in the meantime, you see the very big difference between lead regions like the Amsterdam-Rotterdam region, for example, and many parts, I must admit, of Germany who are still not that well integrated. But if you look at the European map, what you can also see very clearly is a very big divide from north to south and from west to east. So electric mobility, by contrast to the established car business, very strongly, for not to say fundamentally, depends on the support for the operation of these vehicles by the customer on the infrastructure side, on the electricity supply side, and obviously also on a number of other framework conditions like fiscal incentives, like user privileges as the ones in California, for example, with the HOV lane access. On the next chart, I would like to spell the ACEs a little bit differently, at least with what can also be understood with the A, the C, the E, and the S. First of all, talking about autonomy, the question is, how could you, for example, integrate local energy production and storage into usage of your vehicle? So meaning the solar panel on your rooftop, for example. How can you better connect your home charging infrastructure into the overall energy system, making it more efficient and maybe even saving money? How can you then combine mobility and, for example, heating or climatization in a smart manner, managing the overall electricity consumption of a building, for example? And how can you, for example, also work together within communities in order to more efficiently use electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging infrastructure? So these obviously are big questions, and certainly BMW doesn't have a comprehensive answer to that. But what we are doing is we seek to learn as we move forward in a number of experimental setups, pilot activities, and partnerships, which I would like to briefly describe. So on the next chart, we are looking into actually three issues. One is local green energy. So how can one get the best possible synergy between energy that is made in the place where you live and the usage of your car? The second issue is one which is about the overall efficiency of the energy supply system. How can e-mobility not only avoid it creating an additional peak load issue, but maybe even assist in mitigating the peak load topic, which is attached to renewable energies anyway? And the third one is, how can electric vehicle batteries and stationary storage solutions contribute to stabilizing the grid? That's a topic that we have been asked since the e-mobility development started in very many markets, including California, including Germany, including even China. And we think that there is potential out there that can be mobilized in order to generate additional benefits from e-mobility on the energy supply side. So looking at the next chart, one of these activities, and I use it as an example, is BMW Charge Forward, which is a collaboration in California with the utility provider PG&E, which is about demonstrating indeed that customers can benefit from having their vehicle charged in an optimized manner with a view to availability of namely renewable energies. And we hope that also next year we can demonstrate that charging optimization can also lead to a lower electricity bill and thereby add to the attractiveness of driving electrically and charging in a smart manner. We have done a similar project a few years back in Germany in a less sophisticated approach, but at least what we learned back then already was that there is a high readiness of customers to say, okay, I need my vehicle fully charged in the morning at 8. I don't care when it actually the juice goes into the battery. I leave that to the operation by the utility, and the readiness to enable the right kind of communication between the vehicle, the local energy supply, and the overarching optimization of the energy supply system was very high on the customer side, and this is why we want to continue working on that topic. Another example, which is on the next slide, is about how to use used battery. And many manufacturers, Tesla, us, and others, are looking into that. Our first step into this is a large energy storage that is being built up in a test mode in order to demonstrate the suitability of what is still a valuable asset, meaning a used EV battery that can contribute to a more stable utilization of the electricity system. So that's another piece where the role of BMW is obviously not to manage electricity ourselves, but to work with other players who would develop new solutions and provide insight into what works and what may not work so well. In any case, the key learnings, as summarized in the next chart, are very clearly that it is all about working together along the value chain, if you like, of electric driving. That starts, in our case, namely as a company who has many fleet customers, with understanding the needs of the operators of vehicles, be it private customers on the right side, so that they have the best offering for their individual use, but also to support fleet operators in the optimization of an entire fleet of cars. We also see ourselves as partners of industrial players, of small and medium-sized enterprises who would like to start electrifying their fleet of cars and would like to see support for that. But what we also do is, in quite a few places, work with compounds, with real estate developers who want to define the best combination of a new housing development, individual transport solutions, integration into public transport, and also optimize energy usage. So if one goes to the last chart, it is all about getting different players with different interests, with different motivations, to work together efficiently, and also efficiently with a point of view of maybe spending less money than you would have to spend for the usage of your vehicle if you would do it in an isolated manner. With that, I thank you for your attention so far, and look forward to your questions and to the discussion after the next presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you very much for starting the conversation today and for your presentation. I would like to remind the attendees, if you have any questions for Thomas, if you have any questions for our other speakers, please remember to send them over Twitter or submit your questions using the question box at the webinar software at the right of your screen. I would like to now welcome Christian Hochfeld, Managing Director of Agora, an initiative of Stiftung Mercator and the European Climate Foundation. Christian is also a member of the International Advisory Committee of the China Association for Electric Vehicles. He has spent 14 years with ECO Institute, a research institute for applied technology, both by delivering research as well as a member of the management team. He has also held the position of the Director for Sustainable Traffic in China, in China, the GIZ, a leading provider of international cooperation services for sustainable development. Hi, Christian.
Thank you very much, Milena, for this very kind introduction. And good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure and honor for me just to share also some first insights before we get into the discussion and put a little bit into the context of the effort to decarbonize the transport sector and the role of e-mobility and the connection to the grid can play to support this strategies. The first chart, which I hope, is available here, gives a short introduction only to our institution. It was mentioned it's an initiative by two foundations, and it's an independent think tank together with a high-level council, with the mission to support Germany with reaching the goal and the objective of decarbonizing the transport sector, which is mainly the land-based transport sector of freight and passengers until 2050 in Germany. The council of the Agora, which you can or which is indicated on the next slide, is led by Achim Steiner, who is the former Undersecretary of the UN and the Executive director of the United Nations Environmental Programme, and he has been appointed to the administrator of the UN Development Programme. And this council is a sounding board for the Agora. It takes into account all the relevant policy stakeholders from the industry sector and also from civil society. On the one hand, to define what would be the tasks for the Agora to work on a strategy to decarbonize transport in Germany, but also to see and assess the policy recommendations to the question if they would be in a way implementable in Germany to support this decarbonizing transport goal. If we talk about decarbonizing transport, we go to the next slide. What are we talking about here? The transport sector, for those who are not so familiar with the accounting of climate change, contributes to nearly a quarter to the global anthropogenic emissions of CO2. And within this quarter, the main part, 3/4, are from the street sector, so the passenger cars and the trucks on the road. So road transport plays the majority, and trucks and passenger vehicles have a similar share in the emissions. So here it comes to face that we have to decarbonize, especially the road transport sector with the high shares of emission on the one hand, but on the other hand also the other 3/4, which include the energy sector. And the question is, can we gain some synergies by integrating e-mobility as a strategy for decarbonizing transport, also using it using the synergies for similarly decarbonizing the energy sector, the electricity sector at the same time. For Germany, this is shown on the next slide. It's first of all shows the IEA scenarios for decarbonizing transport until 2050, and it shows that we need to come from a 6 degrees scenario to a 2 degree scenario. A lot of efforts from all the sector, which are definitely also different from country to country. But for Germany, and this is now then the next slide, this transfers to very ambitious goals. You see the transport sector on the third column from the right, sorry, that we were not able to reduce the CO2 emissions from transport in the last 25 years. Since 1990, we are stable. It's the only sector in Germany where we were not able to reduce CO2 emissions in absolute terms. In other countries, this is even the case that the emissions from transport have been growing, and especially in emerging economies and developing countries, this is still the case. But if we would like to reach and fulfill our goals and objectives following the Paris Agreement, we have to decarbonize all the sectors, including energy, building, industry, the energy-related sectors by 2050, and to reduce the emissions by 40 to 42% compared to today until 2030, which puts a lot of pressure on the sector to decarbonize. Next slide, please. Just to be sure that we are talking about the same thing, the term Verkehrswende in German, it's a German word, stands for transition of the transport sector to decarbonize it. It's not so well known as the Energiewende. It's also a German word which translates to energy transition, and Germany is quite famous about this, but up to now we are not so famous about the transformation of the transport sector, which will only work if we, on the one hand, combine mobility revolution, which was also mentioned already by Dr. Thomas Becker, with mentioning that we have a kind of new understanding how the individual transport will be done in the future, which will allow us to reduce the energy consumption from transport until the mid of the century by 50%. And this enables us to substitute the fossil fuels which are used in the transport sector by renewables. And only if we combine these two pillars for the transport transformation, we will be able to decarbonize the whole transport sector. The next slide, please. And I mentioned this already. This has different efforts. On the one hand, what we can achieve through avoid, shift, and improve. And on the other hand, what we can achieve by introducing low carbon fuels and increasing the vehicle efficiency for OECD countries and non-OECD countries. Here you can see what will be the potentials, benefits, and the potential emission reductions in OECD and non-OECD countries. And e-mobility, as a main part of the solution for the road transport, which I mentioned, will help us, on the one hand, to use and increase the vehicle efficiency by far, and on the other hand, to introduce electricity as a low carbon fuel while we are decarbonizing also the electricity sector. On the next slide, we see that there is already a market uptake of electrification, which again comes along with great opportunities for decarbonizing the sector, but also with challenges, especially with challenges coming from the coupling of the sectors, which is the main topic from today's discussion. The next slide, please. Here you can see that the electrification from an efficiency perspective, that's following our assessment, is already the benchmark for a couple of transport modes. For light-duty vehicle, this is LDV. For buses, definitely. And I should not mention rail, or I don't have to mention rail, where the discussion on decarbonizing heavy-duty trucks, HDVs, in this sense, heavy-duty vehicles, lead us. It's still an open game. But for the other sectors, I think we can surely say that they would benefit and will be a great contribution to decarbonizing transport, especially with the renewables and integrating renewables also in the electricity grid. The next slide, please. And to underline this, here what we see here is the electricity and the energy demand needed for running a passenger car 100 kilometers from the battery electric vehicle on the left side with a direct use of electricity, which adds up to 15 kilowatt hours in about a couple of years. And this compares to other options for decarbonizing the passenger cars, which definitely use a lot of more electricity. And that means two things which we can derive from this. On the one hand, we have that the electrification of cars contribute to climate protection means we have to extend the renewables also in the grid to a far extent. And this is also true for Germany. We have to extend our share of renewables in the next years, while we have not been able or not taking into account that the transport sector will add another consumer of electricity in the next years. But it also shows that solutions like power to gas and power to liquid, so turning renewable electricity again into fuels, will be less efficient, and therefore to be able to transform the whole transport sector, we might not have sufficient energy from renewable electricity to fulfill our goal to decarbonize transport on other road pathways. That's why we think electrification is the real benchmark, especially for passenger cars. The next slide, please. And one of the reasons is we here compare the situation today to 2030 and compare electric vehicles on the right with plug-in hybrids, diesel cars, and gasoline vehicles. And we see that in the future, especially with lower content of carbon in the production of the electricity, the electric vehicles will have a huge advantage compared to combustion engine cars, even if you take into account the production of the current, the production of the battery, which is sometimes in doubt. But this is what we see from all the life cycle assessments made for electric vehicles. The next slide, please. What we see here is, and this is now all about the coupling of the sectors, the so-called duck curve of the changing grid. What you see here is that this is the, let's say, energy which is demanded and requested, electricity which is requested through a day. And this is here also the example of the US or California. And this, in the future, we will see a lower demand during the daytime, in the middle of the day, and then higher demand for in the evening hours. And this puts a lot of challenges, especially if we put renewables in the grid, solar and wind, which will have a fluctuation in the energy generation in the next years. And by shifting the demand in this sense that we can have energy or electric vehicles as a storage for solar energy and wind energy, especially in these times where the demand is low, by installation of charging infrastructure at work, or shifting the demand in the evening hours by smart charging at home, will benefit the decarbonization of the transport sector, as well as decarbonizing the electricity grid by extending the share of renewables in the electricity. The next slide, please. That shows what already was pointed out by Dr. Becker, that therefore we need really a very strong focus on building up the charging infrastructure as a key for the market uptake of electric vehicles, but also as a key for getting the synergies out of the sector coupling between electricity and transport. And you see that especially public infrastructure makes a lot of difference in the extension of the electric fleet, and also charging at the workplace, which will allow us to reduce, as I mentioned, or which will be able, where we will be able to charge the cars during the daytime when there will be also electricity or based on solar and wind available. The next slide, please, and then I come to the end. Shows only illustrated that we can shift the peaks and the valleys, and to flatten a kind of the duck curve of the changing grid. So this shows that there is you know, a lot of opportunities for EVs, that higher electricity sales can amortize the fixed cost for grid operators, can lower the rate, and charging can shift load from off-peak hours to off-peak hours, sorry, from high-peak hours. And smart charging can be used for services, as Thomas Becker mentioned, that car users can also reduce their electric bill by smart charging. And there will also be a reduced need for stationary storage, which was pointed out. The last slide, please, which shows a little bit also the challenges of the future, is that, you know, it's not only the question of charging the car as a service to the grid, but also that, you know, the potential that the cars can work as mobile storage and can also give electricity to the grid when needed, especially when there will be less in the future, less renewable energy and electricity available from solar and wind. And just to give you an idea that this is a high potential, 1 million EVs intelligently cross-linked in the grid can produce the power of 10 gigawatt, which means the capacity of 60 gigawatt hours as a buffer and as a storage system, which can power at least 7 million households 24 hours. And it shows that there's, I mean, we don't have a bigger potential for capacity than car batteries. But at the moment, neither the OEMs nor the distributed network operators are planning for this bidirectional charging. It's an issue, it's a challenge, but I think we have to take a closer look at it to unfold all the potentials of the sector coupling for decarbonizing both sectors in the meantime, and in the same time, the electricity sector and the automotive sector, which should be our aim. And therefore, I think we need, as Thomas already pointed out, more cooperation in the sector, overarching cooperation to also get this potentials on the road. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. It was very, very interesting. Very quickly, I would very much now like to hand over to our third speaker for the day, Dean Taylor, who is a principal advisor at the Southern Californian Edison. Dean has over 25 years experience in the electric transportation area with a focus of regulatory and legislative affairs, external engagement and business strategy development. He has chaired many coalitions, including the California EV Task Force and the coalitions that created federal EV tax credits, the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, and many more. He has project managed dozens of technical and business planning studies covering over 30 electric drive technologies, including non-road EVs, high-speed rail, and heavy-duty EVs. So without further ado, Dean, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Brilliant, and you should now have access to the mouse.
Great. Thank you for the kind introduction and for inviting me. I'm excited to be here. Next slide. Yeah, great. Next slide. So Southern California Edison is the large utility in the Los Angeles area, going to the east and to the north, with over 14 million residents in the area. We're over 28% renewables today and 40% zero emission, and required to achieve 33% renewables in a couple of years and 50% by 2030. We're mostly a wires business, but have some still have some hydroelectric generation. Next slide. This chart shows what the current status is of EVs in the United States as of this last spring. We'll probably hit about 750,000 by end of the year. You see here that there's at least 6 major OEMs that are contributing to most of that. I would say that a rough estimate for the entire planet is about 3 million EVs by the end of this year, with China taking the big lead. They're probably adding 1 million EVs this year alone. Which kind of brings me to the bigger picture of good news. I've been doing this over 25 years, and it's just kind of stunning what's happened in the last few months. You know, all the announcements on battery prices coming down less than $200 a kilowatt hour. Some say even down to 150 a kilowatt hour. The new ZEV mandate that was announced a few days ago in China probably means adding another 2 million EVs from China in the next couple of years. And then many other nations are
Dina can help with the slides. Just let me know when you need to change slides.
Thank you. Can you go back? Many other nations are also announcing, as you've probably been reading on the press, the intention to ban, gasoline and diesel. All of this is, over the last few years led to significant changes. Companies like Toyota probably are entering the market largely influenced by the Chinese goals. And just in September alone, it's just stunning the number of announcements from GM, Ford, Lincoln, Volvo, BMW, VW Group, Mercedes, Tesla, Nissan, Jaguar, Land Rover, and Mazda, just to name a few. And In addition, the money, I never thought I would see this types of money suddenly available for both EV purchase rebates and infrastructure from the VW settlement. Several large California funding sources. I wish I had time to go into it. California is just amazing how much money we have from different sources out here on this space. In addition, the federal tax credit and significant private investments combined with utility investments, which we'll talk about in a bit. In addition, air quality rules are tightening all over the place. The grid is becoming, much, much cleaner. Coal plants are being retired at a very fast rate compared to anything we've seen in recent years. And I think for the first time in my career, amazing things seem possible. It seems by 2050 that we have the technology to get to 100% renewable grid and mostly zero emission miles, at least for the leading countries. I mean, there's several states and places that are at essentially 100% renewables, be it Norway or Brazil or others, and many states like Hawaii and California that are talking about dramatically larger renewable mandates for the grid and increasing to essentially banning gasoline and diesel at some point. So I don't think most of us would ever thought that would happen in our careers, but it is happening. Next slide. But there are some few challenges. And it's maybe a good challenge to have. In California, we have over 35 battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid vehicles. And I noticed recently there's only 4 vehicles today in California with less than 100 miles range. So the trend is increasing. Just recent data from the Air Resources Board in California says that there'll be another 20 to 25 long-range BEVs, meaning over 200 miles range or more within the next few years, and another 25 or so plug-in hybrids with what I call strong range, meaning they're like the Chevy Volt or the BMW i3 Rex, which is an amazing car that has 100 miles electric range plus another 80 miles gasoline range. And those types of cars, the plug-in hybrid can actually deliver as many electric miles per year as a battery electric when you get those kind of high ranges. But what does all this mean? The implications are that you're going to see a lot more people charging at level 2 at homes. Right now in California, it's roughly 50-50 with charging at what we call level 1, 120 volts, and instead go up to 240 volts, which is of course very common in Europe. But when you have these higher ranges, you're going to need more capability at homes. But it seems like most people are charging at home with these high range cars and strong plug-in hybrids. You don't need that much away from home charging, and when you do need it, it's probably going to be DC fast charging for corridors, as well as for the gas station model or urban DC fast charging stations for those who park on the street or apartments and condos, or for car sharing, self-driving car services. And also workplace charging is evolving. We're seeing a lot of people come to work and not need to charge in. So I think everybody is rethinking what can we do with workplace charging to make it a part of the solution. And it could become a primary charging location for some people, especially with a plug-in hybrid or 200-mile range battery electric vehicle. It can also, as one of the earlier speakers mentioned, become part of the solution to deal with the duck curve of solar generation, over-generation in the middle of the day. But there's probably not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution at workplace. We need to experiment and see other things. And in fact, in general, charging solutions are going to vary by state and country. A lot depends on how many attached and detached single-family homes you have, and also the size of the duck curve problem that you have will depend on how each country or state deals with it. Or even in our area, we're mostly suburban, whereas if you go down south to San Diego, that is a much more urban area with much higher concentration of apartments and condos. So those are examples. Next slide, please. The utility market, as you've heard, is also changing. Most utilities in California are already at 30 to 50% zero emission generation due to the abundance of solar. And solar also in the middle of the day is going to be the least cost time for electricity. The rates are dramatically changing. The grid, people often don't realize how big and ubiquitous the grid is. What amazes me is how easy it is for us to handle really large loads like cruise ships plugging in, or Other, like electric boring machines, can be 10 megawatts, and utilities are used to handling that kind of thing. So it's always good to kind of put that in perspective to realize how big these loads are. When we're talking about EVs at 10 kW. But the bigger trend that often isn't talked about is our system utilization. If you go back 40 years, maybe 50 years, we were at 70–80% load factor, meaning that 80% of the time the grid was being used on a 24/7 basis. Today, it's typically down around 40–45%, and a lot of the reason for that is air conditioning, as well as more energy efficiency and distributed energy resources. In the future, it could go much lower, maybe down to 30–20% due to this trend. But if you start adding in transportation and building electrification, load can make up for much of this lost load, and at the same time help meet the environmental laws here in California. So our EVs in California are typically 70–90% less GHG, and as far as air pollution, at least 85% reduction. So given all of these things, the California legislature gave the investor-owned utilities a new business line in 2015 by passing a law called SB 350 that told us to accelerate all types of transportation electrification. And specifically, it requires us to do long-term, large-scale, behind-the-meter programs and investments, which is something very new for us to go into that space. Next slide. This shows how this trend has suddenly spread around the US. So I'm not going to go into all of this, but the punchline is that as of last spring, that the $1.4 billion in charging station infrastructure is being proposed, most of it on the beyond the meter side. In addition, there's quite a few public education programs as part of these things, because these are the two huge challenges probably that the utilities have a role in, is helping with charging infrastructure as well as public education and awareness. Next slide, please. In California, because the grid is so clean relative, we're much ahead of the rest of the world. Greenhouse gases from the transportation sector are 50% of greenhouse gases, but that's also adding in the refineries. In addition, they're huge contributors, 80% to smog-forming NOx and 95% to cancer-causing PM. I won't go into all of this, but we have very aggressive goals on both air pollution and GHG in California. And the goals, the latest goals are 4 million EVs by 2030 and about roughly 200,000 medium and heavy duty zero emission trucks on the road. And there are those who are saying, because of the recent announcements from China and others, that this number should be much, much higher. So that will soon be debated quite a bit in California. Next slide. Our vision centers around acceptance, availability, and affordability of fueling. Our proposals from Southern California Edison to our regulator, the PUC, totaled $925 million in 2014 and 2017. We've received some of this already, but most of this is pending. I'm not going to go into all of this slide, but you can see that in the green are the things that we've already been received money for. In the black font is things that we're still proposing, but it includes both doing infrastructure such as a make-ready or a rebate for the charging station for both heavy-duty vehicles and light-duty vehicles in many different locations, not only fleets, but workplaces, destination centers, and apartments and condos. And we also are starting to offer some new programs even in single-family homes and other areas, and proposing some innovative things to solve different ways of dealing with apartments and condos, such as giving rewards to rideshare and taxi drivers who use EVs as a way to increase awareness and serve that market. Next slide. One thing that isn't often known is that the air pollution benefits are amazing. When you compare EVs to doing more renewables or energy efficiency, on a per kilowatt hour basis, you get up to 60 times more NOx reduction from heavy duty EVs than you do from these other things. And light duty EVs are reducing 8 times more. Even on the CO2 side, you're roughly getting twice as much. And again, it's a reflection of how clean the California grid is relatively. Next slide. In California, we also, when we talk about CO2, we not only talk about air pollution, but we talk about low income and disadvantaged communities. In our territory, we have 45% of the disadvantaged communities in all of California, and they also tend to be obviously located near the freeways as well as near the freight corridors, because we have an extremely busy port that's serving roughly 40% of the imports coming into the United States. Next slide. And I'm almost done. In other California news, we should expect decisions regarding these big proposals from 6 different utilities in a few months. We also are expecting many, many new innovative rates to be approved. For example, all residential customers are beginning going onto default time of use rates in a few years, and there'll be new daytime rates for everybody where the lowest prices will be in the middle of the day. Edison also has a very innovative proposal where we would eliminate demand charges and then slowly phase them back in, and so which is also very impressive. I wish we had more time. I would love to talk about this huge stakeholder group that the agencies have created here in California, looking at vehicle integration protocols to communicate from the EV to the grid. It involves over 10 automakers and many different charging station companies, utilities, universities, and others. I like the approach they're using. They're essentially crowdsourcing to get the pros and the cons of many different end-to-end solutions. In addition, probably next year, I think the automakers and the utilities and charging station automakers are probably going to be doing several larger scale demonstrations to really better understand the business case for the most promising use cases. Because everyone wants to know how to monetize these grid benefits and which ones are the most valuable. Because the list of potential benefits is amazingly long, like easily 50 different ones, and it can be very confusing, especially in a very complex, deregulated market like we have here in California. So this crowdsourcing type approach is something I'd like to suggest that we do more broadly. It's much better to do a voluntary approach than to have a lot of mandates from the agencies. We're all going to be drowning in data, but it's hard to understand what a lot of all of this means. And a lot of this basic EV data, unfortunately, is not out in the public domain, and agencies, utilities, many of us need better access to the data in order to make the better decisions. California has a lot of additional rulemakings coming up this year and next year on charging stations, charging station access, new mandates on electric cars, buses, trucks, and ports, as well as reforming our rules on cap and trade and low carbon fuel standard. Next slide. I think this is my last slide. So in summary, the big challenges is that we need dramatically accelerated adoption of EVs. 4 million EVs in California is only 12 years away. California right now is about 55% of the total EVs sold in the United States. There's clearly not enough awareness and market education. Many people have no idea that a plug-in hybrid also has a gasoline engine and doesn't need, the same type of charging or range anxiety needs. We need much larger investments in EV infrastructure and clear, bigger role for utilities on how to partner. I mean, our proposals are basically taking away 50 to 70% of the cost from the third-party charging station developers. So that's very attractive, but it's still not clear exactly which role we would have. Should we do make-readies, capitalized rebates, DC as a utility service, or something else? In addition, there's very high rates for away-from-home charging, either AC or DC. I've seen analysis by EPRI that's showing that it's typically up around 40 cents a kilowatt hour, which is about $4 a gallon, which is higher than gasoline here in the United States. And that's just for like 50 kW DC charging or like 7 kW AC charging. If you get into these higher rates, the new trend is going for 200 or even 350 kW charging, the rates will be even higher. And in addition, there's quite a few stranded asset concerns. So finally, there's how best to address several issues, including what to do about those who park on the street and in apartments. There's at least 5 different solutions right now. Nobody knows which is going to work the best. How to best deal with charging and adoption for low-income people. How to lower the costs and make the overall experience much simpler for EV drivers. And then how to improve the business cases for all the stakeholders, including the automakers and the charging station companies, and especially how to monetize the further benefits from the EVs. So thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Dean. Thank you for taking the time to present with us today. Just very quickly, unfortunately, we have very, very, very few minutes for questions and answers. We do have a lot of questions. I am now unmuting Christian and Thomas. Trying to go over the questions we got. I have quite a few questions. People are very much interested in what's BMW doing around kind of new markets or developing countries. We have questions, Thomas, from India, from Kenya, from China as well, kind of asking what is the group's strategy around those markets. And there's also a question around the cost of the vehicles. The question is around how much eventually the cost of the battery changes the price of the car, and what's the strategy regarding this country. So if you could very, very quickly give us your thoughts on that, maybe.
Obviously, we move ahead in close relation to the framework conditions on the ground. So what you can see is that it is far from certain today, what we all thought in the past, that naturally all new technologies would be coming from the big established automotive markets like the US and Europe. If you look at the development in places like Thailand or Mexico, for example, you can see that with the right kind of infrastructure, namely if you think not only about the hardware infrastructure, but also about everything that shapes customer perception on the tech side, for example, you can accelerate EV uptake in markets which would not be the usual suspects. So very clearly, the more strongly the support on charging and on incentives is, the higher the likelihood that we can succeed with our EV offerings in a market.
Mm-hmm.
But very clearly, what is also part of the reality is, as I've tried to indicate for Europe, there is no such thing anymore as a national market. We talk about local markets. We talk about city governments which very strongly shape the readiness of customers to go for an electric vehicle. And there are huge differences between, for example, Amsterdam and Athens, between Lisbon and Munich, for example. So that is part of this development, that for us, the market is more and more defined at subnational level.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Thomas. We have another question. It's regarding kind of recycling and circular economy from Emma specifically. I did want to mention very quickly, if you're interested in kind of circular economy, we did run a webinar a few weeks ago. You are able to find the webinar on the same page that you registered for today's webinar. So Emma is asking what happens to the batteries after they go out of use, specifically for the vehicle. I'm not sure who would like to take the question. We only have a couple of minutes. Christian,
I could give a very brief answer, not to go too much in detail, but I think there are two ways. The first way was already described. It's the second use of the battery in the storage system. When the battery gets out of the car, it should have about 80% of the capacity still, which means that they can be used in storage system outside the car, not as mobile storage, but a stationary storage. And this could replace new batteries. I think it's still open if this will be a bold business case in the future. We will see also concerning questions of reliability for these batteries outside the car. The second thing is that we definitely need a recycling system for EV batteries. We currently have in Europe a rather weak framework because we don't have specific targets for the recycling of traction batteries for cars, which we definitely need in the future. The technology is already there to recycle the critical metals like cobalt, nickel, and but there is still a challenge of finding an economically feasible way to recycle the lithium from the batteries, which would definitely be of high value. But at the moment, it's very difficult. But I'm very sure that we will have ways to recycle lithium in a couple of years, also forced by a good regulation on high recycling rates. which we need for getting the whole ecological integrity of electric vehicles.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we're just about to conclude the webinar, but I would like to ask a last question we got from one of our listeners, just because this is also a topic that will be raised during the Sustainable Innovation Forum in Bonn in Germany. The question is around hydrogen. So what about hydrogen as a solution? I don't know, Thomas or Dean, would you like possibly to respond to this?
I'm going to
Thomas?
suggest
Yeah.
Christian again. He gave a good answer earlier.
Christian?
Well, maybe I just say what we are doing on this. We have a good collaboration on hydrogen fuel cell technology with Toyota. We jointly work on combining optimized storage technology with the fuel cell as another way of providing electric energy for actually what is an electric car. So if we talk about fuel cell, we talk about EVs with an alternative storage and energy transformation system compared to a battery. But very clearly, we have had big discussions on driving with batteries around the chicken and egg issue. For hydrogen, it is very clear, unless there is an infrastructure which is not existent in people's garages or in people's homes, as it is at least the case for quite a few people who go for the battery electric pathway, this cannot take off. So the need for having a clear political decision before you can actually think about selling the cars is, I think, the dominant issue here. If we want to go for hydrogen fuel cells, what you need first is the clear political commitment on the infrastructure end.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of our panelists for taking the time to join us today and to share their thoughts. Thank you very, very much to our listeners for being patient and staying with us for the full hour. The webinar has now come to the end, so you will shortly receive the recording of the webinar. You will be able to share it with your peers and your colleagues and to listen to it again. Thank you everybody very much, and we'll be on there very, very soon again. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.